When I first met Luke, I knew I wanted him to be my husband. It was kind of a scene right out of a Hallmark movie. The first time we really talked, we were on the phone and we talked for hours, so long in fact, that it got late, and while I was on the phone with Luke, I actually got into bed and turned off the lights. It was time to go to bed, but we just kept talking. We went from knowing a little bit about each other to knowing so much about each other. By the end of our conversation, we had shared our testimonies about how we came to believe in Jesus, and when we finally hung up the phone, true story, I got out of my bed and knelt down next to it, and I prayed, God, please let him be my husband. I knew right then I wanted to marry him. We didn't get married for another 3 years, but I knew he was the one. He was the one I had dreamed of my whole life. He was the one that had been designed in my heart to fit. He was the one. Before we go any further, there's a part of the story about when I met Luke that I haven't told you. When I first met Luke, on that night that I got out of my bed and I asked God to please let him be my husband, at that time, I had kind of been dating this other guy. I know it's awful, but here's what did not happen when I talked to Luke, and my heart was so moved, and I knew that he was the one that I would become one with. What I did not do is go back to Luke and say, hey, you're the one. I know it. I am sure of it. But I've kind of been hanging out with this other guy, and well, do you just want to come hang out with us? I did not do that. And I can only imagine if I had, Luke would have looked at me very funny and said, absolutely not. The thing is, nothing in me wanted to do that. I no longer desired anything or anyone else. I just wanted Luke. I'm afraid sometimes we treat our relationship with God like that. We come to a Bible study and we experience God. We understand him more and we get to know him. We fall in love with him and we know that he is what we need. In those moments, he is our heart's deepest desire. But instead of fully surrendering to him, instead of saying, Jesus, you are all that I need and all that I want, and turning to follow him, we invite him to come along with us with what we're already doing, in the direction we're already going. But that's not what the Bible says. Jesus doesn't ask us to invite him into the life in the direction that we're already going. Instead, he says, come, follow me. Proverbs 31:30 says, charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. We discussed how to smile without fear of the future. We need to exchange the fear of the future for the fear of the Lord. The Hebrew word translated fear in the fear of the Lord is defined as to revere or to stand in awe. You may have heard it said, God is awesome. But I feel like our word awesome has been watered down. We say a lot of things are awesome these days. So I looked for another word for awesome to try to better grasp this idea of standing in awe of God. The word I found is breathtaking. Breathtaking. This week we talked about the difference between knowing God informationally and knowing him relationally. We learned that when we see God as he truly is, we will see ourselves as we truly are. We won't desire to invite God into what we're already doing. Instead, we will want to offer every breath to him and present ourselves as a living sacrifice. Isaiah chapter 6 gives us an incredible visual of this concept. In the first 5 verses of this chapter, we get kind of a peek behind the curtain into heaven. Starting in Isaiah 6 verse 1, it says, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Every time I read this, it almost takes my breath away. The prophet Isaiah saw the Lord sitting on his throne, high and exalted, and he saw these heavenly beings worshiping God. Some translations describe them as flaming. If you've ever heard a clap of thunder that was so loud, it felt like it made the walls of the house shake a little, Isaiah witnessed the foundations of the thresholds shake as these seraphim cried out to each other, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord." I know this isn't the image of something we're accustomed to seeing during the ins and outs of our everyday lives. But as we seek to exchange the fear of the future for the fear of the Lord, let's slow down and try to wrap our minds around this. Imagine God on his throne right now, right where you sit, this scene unfolding in heaven. Angels crying out, "Holy, holy, holy." The thresholds trembling and smoke filling the temple. Then Isaiah, having seen God as he truly is, saw himself as he truly was, and called himself lost and unclean. Not only himself, but his entire nation. The words used here are strong. Some translations say ruined or doomed. According to Isaiah, this is doomsday, a sinful man in the presence of a holy God. You may be thinking, wait a minute, didn't we just say last week that the presence of God was the absence of fear? So how in the world do these two things go together? Well, I'm so glad you asked. I know this picture can make it seem like God is unapproachable and even scary. It can possibly bring up feelings that make you want to keep your distance because you're afraid. So let's look at another example of the fear of the Lord that will help us connect this unapproachable, holy God with the relationship that comes when we fear the Lord. Psalm 130 is known as a song of ascent. It would have been recited as ancient Israelites journeyed towards Jerusalem to offer sacrifices at the temple. They would say the words of this psalm as they literally drew nearer and nearer to the place where the presence of God dwelled. Let's see what happens as the psalmist physically draws near to God. First, the psalmist begins by acknowledging the depths of his despair. He says, "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. Hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my pleas for mercy." A lot of times in Psalms, these kinds of depths have to do with circumstances like sickness or war. But the disaster this psalmist is writing about is different. He has come face to face with the sickness of his own sin. And as he draws nearer to God, he becomes more and more aware of his helplessness. This echoes what we read from the prophet Isaiah when he encountered the holiness of God, and his response was, "Woe is me." Just like we saw in the verses in Isaiah, God's presence exposes our imperfection. As long as we keep our distance, we might be able to pull out those measuring sticks that we talked about last week and feel like we have some sort of righteousness that we could point to, or good deeds, or something we've accomplished. But the closer we come to the holiness of God, the more aware we become of the depths of the disaster of our sin. Then we come to verse 4 and encounter a turning point from this helpless, hopeless state. It says, "But with you there is forgiveness that you may be feared." Earthly fear separates us from what we fear. If we're afraid of something, we naturally place distance between ourselves and that thing. Here in Psalm 130, we see how the fear of the Lord is not something that separates us from God. Instead, it is an invitation into relationship with God. God's forgiveness invites us into his presence, and allows us the gift of a relationship with a holy God. The fear of the Lord opens the door that we may worship God and serve him. And as we read in Psalm 137, the fear of God brings hope in his steadfast love and in his plentiful redemption. As a woman who fears the Lord, the Proverbs 31 woman submits her life to God and finds assurance in his authority. She doesn't invite him into her prearranged plans. Instead, she worships him, rests in him, and finds security in him alone. When I met Luke, I knew I wanted him and only him. I no longer wanted to go the way I was headed. I wanted to rearrange my life. To become women who smile without fear of the future, we must first become women who fear the Lord. Maybe you feel that sense of awe today, and maybe you don't. That's okay. No matter where you are with this, you can always cry out to God and ask, help me love you more. Help me know you more. Give me an awe for who you are.